Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, before I begin today, I just want to thank everybody who has supported my Indiegogo campaign for my new graphic novel. It launched yesterday, less than 15 hours ago, for me anyways, while I'm recording this, and we've already reached over 100 backers and over $6,500, which is spectacular. I cannot thank you enough if you have supported my book. And for anyone else, even if you're mildly interested, I will put the link in the description for the Indiegogo page where you can go and take a look at my graphic novel. And I suppose I should be talking about my graphic novel today, having just launched it yesterday, and that's what I should be doing a video about, but I'm not going to, because I want to talk about hero once again today. This is always the driving force behind what I want to discuss, the idea of a true hero. And today I want to talk about the loss of language and ability to even understand what a true hero is. I think this is something that we are going to have to grapple with in our civilization over the next couple of years, next couple of decades. And truly, I believe that the loss of the ability to understand a traditional hero is the canary in the coal mine for Western civilization. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, the reason why I was prompted to think about this was because in my last video, I got a very interesting comment. Now, very briefly, I'll go over my last video, plus I'll add a few things. But if you want the entire argument, I'll link that at the end and also in the description if you wish to go watch it. I talked about the fact that for Western civilization, the reason I would say historically that it developed the way that it did, the reason why it is so adapted to change and the ability to create, which has given it a prominent, at the very least, position within the world and civilizations. Again, for my own part, historically, I would say this comes from the geographical region that Europe actually exists within. Whereas, within the last couple of millennia, this very small place with a harsh climate was able to produce these civilizations because of the geography and because of how the land allowed for these civilizations to develop. You have many natural boundaries, mountains and rivers and forests and all these kinds of things, which allowed for a small pocket of civilization to become its own little, well, just that, pocket of civilization. But at some point, when they got big enough, they would cross the river, they would cross the forest, they would cross the mountains, and all of a sudden they're in conflict with the people who were on the other side of that mountain. And I would have to say, a lot of people look down on Western civilization because they look at its legacy, one of its legacies anyways, as being war. And I would have to say, well, yeah, that's actually one of the legacies of Western civilization. And I'm sorry to say that because of human nature, I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. I do believe, again, through my study of history, that history is in some way cyclical, that you have prosperity. Prosperity is followed by licentiousness and vice, or in other words, a misuse of that prosperity. That licentiousness and vice leads to war, and that war leads to a rebalancing of things, whereas people have to become virtuous and have to live in accord with reality in order to really survive, in order to keep what they love alive. And that living according to virtue once again brings you back to prosperity, which starts the whole thing over and over again. Unfortunately, I would say that the First and Second World War, with the mindset that came out of them, where everybody kept on saying never again, and I really would like to believe the idea of never again. I just don't think it actually can exist within what human civilization is, within what human nature is. We have to realize that war is part of what we have to deal with. But the idea of never again, the idea that we will never actually go into such a war again, has stunted our growth to the extent that we have no war, we have no ability to express our conflict, and that conflict is being turned internally onto ourselves. But my point being in my last video, that this geography and this conflict that emerged from it with these various kinds of pockets of civilization prompted an atmosphere really where it was the strong who survived. It was the strong city. It was the strong civilization. And that strong civilization that was needed, it prompted the people there to really face the cold hard fact that politics and tribalism just don't go together. And this developed the great individualism of European civilization, which is banked by ideas like liberty and ideas like charity and forgiveness. Again, I see all of these being supports of each other and emanating from a position whereas you recognize what a human is and what their nature is. But again, in that other video, what I talked about was the fact that you had Europe. It was a harsh climate, and you had people trying to survive in this harsh climate, and this is what happened. And I got someone in the comments say, you're talking primarily about Greece and about Italy. These are not harsh conditions for people to live in. And I would say, yes and no, because this brings out the point that I want to talk about. The fact that I'm talking about logic a lot, and the fact is that with logic, you have basically, as best I can describe it, is the application of geometry, Euclidean geometry, on language, so that your language becomes as efficient as a geometrical proposition, almost as a mathematical proposition. And within that, you have to recognize really what principles there are, what universals there are, what unchangeable things there are, like human nature. And you have to be able to understand also the non-essential things. That is to say, quite literally, the things that are not part of the essence of something else, but simply exist as an add-on to the essence of what the thing is. And when you take all of those into account, you can get a very good picture of reality. And one of the things about logic is the fact that it has to be done within the present indicative active. That is to say, within the present tense. You always have to bring your argument to the present tense if you want to have a correct form for your argument. And it does give you a bit of a false sense of security when you're thinking about other things like history. Now, first of all, here's something I haven't said in a long time, but I really hate the way that modern education divides everything into these little sections and little subjects, not having any connection between them, fracturing the idea of knowledge. And you go to English class, and then you go to math class, and you go to gym class, and all of these things are separate, and in your mind, they have no connection to each other. If you are actually examining these things, according to reason and logic, they have tremendous connection. They're all connected to one central point. And you would be taught how math plays into the way that you speak, how math plays into what you do when you play a sport. All of these things, they are connected, and history is no exception. The logical reason, really, why you would look at history is the fact that you're going to look at these events in the past. Typically, what you really should do is look at them and try to clear away the accidents. Try to understand why this thing happened. Was it because of human nature? Was it because of something unchangeable within man? Because if it was, if you do those things again, it's going to happen again. It's going to play out the exact same way. And so if it's something bad, you don't want to do that again. If it's something good, it will bring about your prosperity. And so you want to do those things. But the point being is that you're not talking about what is in the present indicative active when you're looking at history. Again, you can take those arguments forward and discuss them in that way if you wish to do it logically, but a lot of people look at the subject of history and try to apply to it the even norms of a logical, rational structure and say, to use a almost pop culture reference, to say that all things are equal. But when you're looking at history, all things are not equal. And I just want to go over one example of this from my historical background. And that example is agriculture. And I'll try to get through this with some speed because it might not be the most interesting thing to most people. But if you look at agriculture, if you look at the way Western civilization developed, one of the first things that you learn in history is that really there were two separate sections of European civilization. You had the northern section and the southern section. And you distinguished between the two by the three things that they used as staples for the diet of their people. Within the south, it was wheat and the olive and the grape. Within the north, it was, if I remember correctly, the apple, milk, and honey. And one of the things that's not readily apparent to us when we're studying history in this comfortable day and age is the fact that these are three staple things that they used to survive. And they really didn't have anything else. Now, I know there were some smaller things that they would farm, but really, think about the idea that you had three and only three things of which you could subsist on your entire civilization. Now, some people may say, of course they had meat, but yes, I would agree they had meat, but a lot of people don't realize the fact that herds used to be a lot smaller than they are today and how an actual herd works. I worked on a ranch for a little while, and if you were to feed people a majority of meat all of the time, even with your modern giant herds, they would be gone in no time. So really, you can't depend upon meat to be the driving force behind what you're going to feed your civilization. You have to look at these other foods. And these three staples that each of these parts of Europe depended upon were what helped build Western civilization. Because it got to a point where you had, at the very least, three things. Three things was a bounty for these people. Why? Because if one of them failed, then you had two more to fall back on. If two of them failed, then you had at least one to actually survive on. And this allowed for these civilizations to become stable and to grow. And what people really don't recognize most of the time is the fact that the reason they only had these three things to depend upon is because they had no notion, no idea of what farming techniques we have today, nor did they have the ability to use what we have today. The Europeans of that time did not have anything like an onion. They didn't have anything like a tomato. They certainly didn't have anything like a potato. These are all, believe it or not, technologies, food technologies that have been brought into our civilization over the last couple of millennia. And just look at the fact that most civilizations see the plow as being something handed down by a god. And again, to think about a couple of things within just the Mediterranean civilization and why it was actually harsh, because these people were subsistence farmers for the most part. If you look at the fact that, yes, they had wheat, but wheat, again, is not the wheat that we have today. It has, over millennia, been reduced in height so that it actually can survive things like wind and rain and maybe even hail and snow if they come early. Because if those things beat down your wheat, they're going to be pretty much useless and you're going to have a famine. Really, one of the technologies, the massive leaps forward in wheat technology, came only about 80 years ago. I don't think it even was 80 years ago, which took wheat and made it so much shorter so that it could survive wind and rain. Again, if you look at the grape, you have to realize that it took millennia of people cultivating these things in order to make sure that they would survive the conditions and the changing of locations when people went from one place to another. If you look at the olive, most people don't realize that it takes about 30 years of tending an olive tree before it actually has olives on it. So again, this all points to the fact that, look, these are stable civilizations. If I'm planting an olive tree today, I'm most likely not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for my children. I'm doing it for my grandchildren. Those are the people that are going to actually pick the fruit off of this tree. And to top it off, I want to hit you with a bit of a statistic. The statistic is that within those older civilizations, and really mostly up until the present time within our modern civilization, you had farmers. And the farmers that we have today, you can get one farmer working for one day and he will be able to produce enough food to feed 10 people for a day. But within older civilizations, that was completely reversed. You would need 9 farmers working for a day in order to feed 10 people for that day. And so that one person was all that existed for someone to actually learn, have the leisure time to learn to do things like read and write, to do things like to think about how you could ensure to have a stable government, to do things like be a soldier to defend your civilization. And the point is that if you have nothing but subsistent farmers, you're not going to have a civilization. You're going to have people scratching by. You're going to have people just thinking about surviving. And there is a great example within history of this, and it is the example of ancient Greece, because there is a massive difference between the Greek culture of Troy and the Greek cultures of Athens and Sparta. Between those two Greek civilizations, there was a dark ages for Greece. And we don't even know why this came about, but it came about to the point where people had to return to subsistent farming. And everybody lost the ability to do the things that allowed them to pass down the ideas which made the civilization great at the time of Troy. Because people no longer had the ability to have that one person who could actually read and write, that one person who could actually do the luxurious things of passing down history, of passing down knowledge, this kind of knowledge was lost. And they went into a dark ages, and they had to begin again with gathering this knowledge when they could hundreds of years later. This, by the way, is why you have people in ancient Sparta, in ancient Athens, and all the other city-states thinking of these heroes from Troy as being godlike people. Why? Because even at that time, they had no idea how these older people who lived 800 years before them, were able to do some of the things that they did. Because all of that technology, all of that knowledge had been lost through that dark ages. And so my point is, number one, yes, it was harsh conditions within ancient Greece and Rome, because again, most people were subsistence farmers. It was very easy for them to fall into ruin, very easy for them to fall into famine. It took fighting tooth and nail to make sure that their civilizations actually kept on going. And number two is the fact that that balance is not necessarily always going to be there. It can be destroyed, and when it is destroyed, your civilization can be completely wiped off the map. And here's where I bring this forward to today. If you think about all of that I've talked about just now, about how easy it is to lose your civilization through losing the ideas and the ability to transmit those ideas from one generation to a next, and then look at our civilization, you will see the same thing happening over the last 5 to almost 800 years, where we have had a loss of the ability to understand the ideas that actually build our civilization, that actually are the underpinnings, the pillars for our civilization. Slowly but surely, over those hundreds of years, there has been a disintegration in the ability to even understand the language behind those ideas. And while I'm sure a lot of you place no actual merit in what academia says these days, most academics really understand and accept the fact that today, in Western civilization, we live in a philosophical wasteland. Yes, we have great technologies. Yes, we have great comfort. But talking philosophically and the ability to understand deep, complex ideas, we live in the equivalent of a zombie apocalypse. And I use that analogy quite specifically because you have these zombified people walking around, your quote-unquote progressives, your NPCs, all of these people. They just can't even begin to think, to understand the complex ideas that built their civilization and that keep it running. And as I said at the beginning of this video, I truly believe that the idea of hero, the ability for our civilization to understand what a traditional hero is, this is the canary in the coal mine. If this idea is lost, if most people within your civilization can't even conceive of how to understand what this idea is, there is no way your civilization is going to understand those bigger concepts, those things like individuality, those things like forgiveness and charity, those things like liberty. And once that happens, our civilization is going to be like the ancient civilization of Greece. Without the ability to transmit those ideas from one generation to the next, those ideas which are a description of how reality works and what the human reality is, if we can't do that, the civilization that we live in will fall. The civilization we live in will enter into a dark ages. We need to recognize, just like those subsistence farmers that lived within Greece and Rome, we need to realize how important the transmission of these ideas about reality and human reality actually are, and how they build our civilization and allow it to continue to exist, and not take for granted the fact that it's always going to be there. Because if we ignore all that, our civilization is not going to last. And it makes me think of one of my favorite philosophers, someone who most people don't really know about. He is a German philosopher. His name is Josef Pieper, and he lived in Germany at the time of the Second World War. He was a German citizen at that time. He realized all of these things that were going on about him, and he was prompted to write these beautiful essays on virtue and how their civilization, and really Western European civilization and the civilizations of the world, need to cling to virtue, need to return to virtue if they don't want this political reality of 1930s Germany actually taking over what we see before us today. And a lot of his essays were actually written in the 1950s and 60s. A lot of them have only been translated into English over the last couple of decades, so that's probably why a lot of people don't know who he is. But as he was writing in the 50s and 60s, of course, Nazi Germany was long gone. He saw his homeland actually freed from this oppressive idea that he was struggling against, and yet he was still in the 1950s and 60s struggling against these ideas because he saw them everywhere. He was able to see them up close and personal when he lived as a young man in his native land. And so he was able to see the strains of them in every other place that he went to. And he was fighting tooth and nail philosophically to bring us back to virtue. But the quote that really comes to mind from him when thinking about all this, and I'm going to paraphrase, he said that if we continue on this path, There will come a time where not only the executioner will not understand why he's executing a prisoner, but the prisoner themselves will not have the ability to understand, will not have the knowledge, or even the language within him to understand why he's being executed. And unfortunately, I would have to say that I agree wholeheartedly with him. And if we, as a civilization, lose ideas like the traditional idea of a hero, lose the ability to understand that concept itself, that human concept, that thing within us that we all wish to be, if we lose that, we, as a civilization, we are going to become that prisoner. Anyways, hopefully I've given you something new to think about. If I did, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, hopefully I'm doing my own part, not just here, but within my graphic novel, to express the idea of hero, the true idea of a true hero to our current civilization. And if you have any likings for that kind of a story, I would ask that you click on the link in the description to go over to the Indiegogo page where my graphic novel is and take a look and see if it's for you. And once again, I have to immensely thank everyone who has already backed my graphic novel. As they say in Gaelic, 1,000 thank yous. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.